Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. For many thought leaders in the nonprofit sector, the minority rather than the majority have had the lion's share of influence on shaping policies that impact charities for far too long. Although the vast majority of charities in Canada are small, a minority of larger, well funded organizations have dominated public discourse, influenced government policy, and regulation of the sector. We'll take a closer look at what the impacts have been historically and what we can do to make access to influence more fair and equitable and more reflective of the sector and the communities it serves. To help us understand these important issues, please welcome Liban Abokor, the CEO of Reimagine Labs, a tech firm that harnesses AI for service design in the social and public sectors. He co authored the Unfunded Report, which revealed philanthropic disparities affecting Black Canadian communities. He co founded the Foundation for Black Communities, which was established as Canada's first philanthropic foundation dedicated to investing in Black communities. Liban volunteers as a board member with the Samara Centre for Democracy, Shoot for Peace, and Toronto's Economic Development Advisory. He holds a Doctor of Laws from Carleton University. Welcome to the podcast, Liban.
Hi, Mary. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So glad you could join us. Can you start off? Can you start off by telling us about the Unfunded Report you co-authored and how that led you to co-founding the Foundation for Black Communities?
Well, I think it was the reverse. We founded the Foundation for Black Communities first because we had recognized that there was, both from an anecdotal standpoint, but also just practical observation, a gap in the level of support going to Black communities at such a critical time. Going back to 2020, we're faced with this unprecedented public health crisis in COVID, and we're looking at organizations having to fill services that they probably never imagined at a sense with a sense of urgency that they never experienced before. And our concern was, how do you serve a population with tremendous need when your cupboards are bare? And so we really wanted to ensure that if the nonprofit sector is going to be a safety net, it should be a safety net that actually can help and can capture those who need it at the time they need. The unfunded report was simply a confirmation of the things we understood intuitively and through experience as well. And so when we were telling folks Black communities aren't being funded, I think there were really well meaning leaders that said, no, of course we fund Black led organizations. Have you not seen our support for the YMCA or the local Boys and Girls Club or such and such? And we'd say, no, you're right. They absolutely are groups that are supporting Black communities. But what we're talking about is a little bit deeper than that. We're talking about those groups that are designing solutions by the community for the community in a way that meets the needs across the country. And if you know, while we wish there would be Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs in every community, there simply aren't. So how do you find more proximate local solutions? And how do you ensure that those solutions reflect the people using them? And that's why the foundation was stood up. What it found was something remarkable, that only 7 cents out of every $100 was going to serve Black-led organizations, or support rather Black-led organizations. And the moment that report came out, I think it was a sobering reality for so many of my colleagues. Many called and said, you know what, we were wrong. We thought we were doing enough, but it's clear we can do more. And that was a breakthrough moment for us with that report.
It certainly was a very influential report. I read a lot about it at the time that it was published. It, along with other published reports about the lack of funding to Indigenous-led organizations, really made clear about how organizations are not funded in this sector in quite an equitable way. Can you talk a bit about that and what the reality is in the sector today, even since that time that it was published? Have things really changed?
That's a great question. The answer is yes and no, right? There are groups like the Definity Foundation that emerged after 2020 and now include Indigenous and Black communities as a core part of their constituency. You have groups like the Vancouver Foundation, you have groups like Toronto Foundation, you have groups like Laidlaw and Inspirit, and so many others. Our partners, including MLSC, Canadian Tire, all of them who've made conscientious and concerted efforts to fund Black led organizations directly, not tangentially, not as a part of their overall work, but in meaningful and specific ways. So we've seen that. The challenge is, have we made up the gap? Black communities represent nearly 3.5% of the Canadian population. By 2036, Mary, will represent nearly 5.5%. So that means for every $100, we should be getting somewhere between $3.50 to 5.50. If you want to be equitable, then we should actually see that number be dramatically bigger, because many of the disparities that we want to address are disproportionately affecting Indigenous and Black communities. So my answer is yes, we've seen some positive steps, including the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Resiliency Fund and the Foundation for Black Communities, who, in our own case, just distributed $9.5 million to 161 groups. That would make us, in a number of provinces, the single largest investor of Black communities outside of outside of government entities, and that's something we're proud of. But I think the sector should be concerned by, because there's a lot of bigger players than us that should probably want that title.
Yes, absolutely. So it certainly paints a picture that, like, while you're the largest funder, why aren't there other larger funds stepping up? I guess is really the point, that it actually.
There's lots of space, a lot of opportunity, and I think there is intention and desire. Let's just figure out a way to move from conversation and desire into action. And I think that there's hope that that'll occur. The final thing I'll say on this point is we're being encouraged to put out unfunded 2.0, and it'll be an opportunity for us to use our same methodology again to see whether or not we're actually funding more Black-led organizations. And I think a 5-year period is a really good time to do that. So look out for that on the horizon.
Yeah, I'd love to get you back in studio to talk about that. So, if we could look at from the bigger picture, were some of the challenges? What are they still in terms of what's facing Black-led organizations when it comes to gaining a larger portion of funding, and what needs to shift in order to get more of the larger funders, including foundations and companies, government, and individual donors, to give more significant support to Black-led organizations?
I think there are some. I think there are a multitude of reasons. I'll go through three quickly. Number one, I think it starts with relationship. When we look at the boards and staffing of large foundations and charities, I think it's honest. We can honestly say they don't represent the communities that are often overlooked, and that's not a coincidence. If you don't have relationship experience or location with those communities, it's not that you don't care about them; it's that they're not top of mind. Their issues and how to help them may not be top of mind. In fact, I've heard folks say we don't want to impose solutions on those communities, and we're looking to build relationships. And so I think that's one. I would say I think we probably need to do a better job of how we recruit our boards. And I think we need to reimagine the way that we hire as well. So that's number one. Number two, I think there's some practical issues around a lot of the Black-led nonprofits, somewhere between 70 to 80%, according to the data that we've been collecting at the foundation, are non-qualified donees. And up until recently, I think there's been a reticence, some anxiety around funding non-qualified donees and the administrative burden that they face. Um, then the third is no one has funded you before, so I don't want to take the risk of being number one. And that's the problem, right? That last one for me. Just because no one has funded that organization before, so what you look is you look at their financial capacity. Have they handled money before? You know, the foundation doesn't look at that. For FFBC, when we are reviewing applications, we don't judge you based on whether or not you've managed money before or gotten money before. That's not an indication of trust to us. The greatest indication of trust is, do you know the issue? Do you know your community? Do you have a feasible plan? And are you committed to delivering it? And then we trust that you're going to be able to do that. And so I think the last question around how do we become less risk averse and more hopeful in supporting organizations has probably been another reason. So those are some of the reasons we found people not wanting to fund, a lack of relationships, some of the technical issues around supporting non-qualified donees. And the final one, people are afraid sometimes to be the first, which is a shame. I think we should all be excited about initiating something.
I want to take you, I guess, to take a look at the bigger picture in terms of sort of the political influences that are impacting our country here. You know, in a recent podcast episode, we heard some of our guests talking about how DEI rollbacks under the Trump administration may have had ideological and funding impacts here in Canada. What are your thoughts on this? And are you seeing this play out in terms of Black led organizations receiving support in Canada?
Yeah, I think that we're probably not in the same position to see how grant seekers are experiencing this. I think folks are both polite and mindful about the way they express those sentiments to us, given that we're a Black led philanthropic foundation. So I'm mindful that the answer is no. I haven't heard anyone say we're rolling back. So that's a testament to our Canadian philanthropic and charitable sector. Now, if they were, I think I'd probably be the last person they'd admit something like that to as well. But I'm hopeful that that's not the case. I'm hopeful that Canadians are actually doing the opposite, which is leaning in and saying we're not gonna remove support at a time where it's most needed. And that's what we've been hearing from our partners, right? And even groups that we're not partnered with closely, but are very meaningful actors in this space. So I call me naive, but I hold Canadians in much higher regard than that. I think we're going to be there for each other when the time comes.
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of Canadians commit to a sort of unity that we haven't seen in literally decades. So I think it's a sort of an extraordinary moment. So I certainly hope you're right. Um, Now, along with the inequitable funding models, do you see similar issues when it comes to connecting with policymakers? Are larger, often white led organizations getting more of the opportunities to connect with government officials and policymakers, literally influencing the policies that will impact the very organizations that make up the sector?
Look, I say this with deep respect, especially as many of the folks, many of my friends and peers are the ones leading the work within these umbrella organizations and networks. But they know it's not working. They know the way that we're doing things doesn't work. And it's certainly not their fault entirely. You can set all the right objectives, but if the tactics that are deemed acceptable uh, aren't suited for the urgency of the moment, the result is inertia. In other words, I think that there's this sense that we can wait, we can understand, we can study, we can have a longer view of things. When that's not the case, the saying is, you can wait, you could save for a rainy day, but if you look outside and it's pouring, you should bring out the umbrella, right? And so I think that we can do more and we can do faster and we can be uh, more demanding of our folks in the public policy sector. And frankly, I'm seeing more and more communities do that better. Most recently, we were in Ottawa, a group of Black led organizations, and doing direct lobbying and policy advocacy for issues that matter to us, including sustaining some investments we saw in 2021 and 2022 to support Black communities. So I think there's also a responsibility on our side to say, no one's closing the door on us. We've got to figure out a way to ensure that we're also at the table, that our voices are being heard. And I think we're not only learning how to do that. We're not only learning how to do that now, but we're becoming pretty successful at it.
I'm curious what you think about how the sector does in terms of how it advocates for itself, in the sense that, we have the mining sector, we have an oil and gas sector. Well, we have a nonprofit sector, which is like 9% of the GDP of our country. How do you think we're doing through our umbrella organizations or the networks that we have, or even the CRA Advisory Council? How do you think that they're doing in terms of having influence? And is there enough diversity in the voices and the organizations that are involved in these discussions?
I think everyone recognizes that there isn't enough diversity. I mean, that's why at the very last minute, we often get folks reach out to us and say, "Hey, we're doing such and such a thing. Could you be a part of it?" Or other partners. So I think we know that there isn't enough diversity. I think that there's too much politeness. There's too much deference to the pace that tolerates human suffering in ways that should alarm us. We've become detached, frankly, as a sector, reducing people to data points and treating crises like academic exercises. I think that is another problem. So again, I say that we need a renewed sense of urgency. Advocacy should be redefined to center those who've historically been sidelined, not as an afterthought, but as like a fundamental design principle in the way that we approach it. That's my non-answer to your question. If I were more direct, I would say I think we could do a better job of who's leading these organizations, um, and who's supporting them and the way that they're getting their information. But also, I think um, we need to do a better job of speaking about the impact we have. You just spoke about us being 9% of the GDP. How many jobs do we create? How big is our procurement um, expenditures? How are we reducing some of the key metrics or KPIs that governments care about? How are we doing that right now as policies are being designed at the federal level? Those are the kind of things I think we need to become better at. And I see some positive signs. I really do. Um, but I also know that the organizations we have are often not well funded. Our business models require people to pay membership fees as a part of the size of their endowments, and I think or assets, and I think that also creates some, frankly, outsized influence for some groups who do get the funding, and others who don't, right? And so I think that there's a recalibration that needs to exist and say, just because you provide a bigger chunk to the network, it doesn't mean that your voice or your interests are greater than those who offer slightly less.
Well, I guess that other raises the other question I had, which is not just in terms of diversity of voices, but also, I guess, this extraordinary situation we have where we have the vast number of the 85,000 charities in Canada being very small organizations, but we only hear from the big, well-funded ones, or at least they seem to have the ear of the government, and other important bodies that regulate the sector. What can we do to ensure that smaller organizations have a place at the table?
Let's start with language. Let's not call them small, right? Let's call them what they are. They're unfunded. The, their size is directly correlated with the lack of resources that they have. But if you look at the issues that they're dealing with, the populations that they're serving, those are exactly the ones that our sectors say that they care about. And more importantly, that the government says they care about. Like the language of our governments recently have been the middle class, right? That's the big middle. And that's exactly where these unfunded organizations often live. I think we need to reimagine the language that we're using. We need to be thinking about, is it bad that the universities, hospitals, and arts foundations or institutions are getting lots of funding? I don't think we need to say that that's wrong. I think we should continue to invest in those areas. And I think we need to take the challenge to fund even more to these other groups. We can do both. We don't have to do one or the other. The disbursement quota is not a limit. It's a guidance. It's the floor, not the ceiling. We can fund those other groups now if we wanted to. So I think the conversation needs to be, are we more concerned with the preservation of our organizations and assets? Or are we more concerned with addressing the issues of the moment in the right way at the right time? That's the issue. That's the question that we're going to be faced with in this incredibly unpredictable and volatile future that we're all hurling towards. And I think the best of us are going to say we can do more. And that doesn't mean that we have to take anything away from others in order to do so.
I've spoken to other thought leaders, folks who've spent a lot of time addressing some of these questions, and certainly and being involved in discussions about them. And some say the whole sector needs a complete overhaul. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is it time to really completely change how we think about nonprofits and charities, the structures that fund them, and actually, also address the extraordinary contribution that they make to society in a way that, I guess, reworks the manner, the relationships that we have with funders and government, for example, to show, as you say, what the KPIs are?
The timing of your question is so uncanny. I just returned from a week at the TED conference, which you're all familiar with. Um, and while there, we got a peek and got to explore breakthroughs in everything from climate technology to repurposing existing drugs to solve untreated diseases. to everything to artificial intelligence. The common thread was we're now capturing the full breadth of human knowledge and accelerating our ability to test solutions and avoid repeating the failures of the past. That means you have to always constantly reimagine the way you do things in order to not repeat the failures of the past. And it introduces kind of complexity where it's hard to predict what happens in the next 2 to 3 years, you know, let alone the next decade, because I don't think anyone was able to predict COVID a couple of years ago. No one was able to predict the advancement of artificial intelligence, and I don't think anyone was able to predict that Canada would have to defend its sovereignty against its nearest ally, right? So I think the next couple of years are difficult, but there are some things that make us consider where we might be, and then to ask, do we have the right system to take care of us there? I'll put a question to you, uh, or maybe I'll put it to you this way: artificial intelligence is making it easier so that many businesses reduce their demand on labor. Are you familiar with this? There are a number of thinkers that are talking about a world where we're facing structural unemployment, where ideas like universal benefits are not just a nice to have, but they might actually become a necessity. Um, in such a volatile world, our sector has to become the stabilizing force. It has to be a cushion that reinforces safety, cohesion, and trust, right? We'll need to fund in more coherent and collaborative ways because as government funding or income generated by income taxes, as that decreases, the ability for them to deliver services also decreases. So our sector is going to become more and more relied upon. That means that the approach that we fund, 12, 24-month, one time, non discretionary giving, is no longer going to fit. We're going to have to think about a whole new way of giving that is sustainable, that is funding deeply, strategically, and at the scale that matches the problem that we have. And at right now, we don't do any of that. We don't fund strategically, we don't fund deeply as a sector, and we don't fund to meet the issue of the day. So I think that's how we're going to have to change in light of a future. While as unpredictable as it is, there are some patterns that make us believe that we're probably not going to have the social economic realities that we have today, and so we're going to have to find a new system that calibrates itself towards that. If I can add maybe one more item there, I think you heard me talk about safety and trust, but it's cohesion that I think we're probably going to have to invest the most in. What does it mean to be Canadian, Mary? And what does it mean to be Canadian? It means to be a neighbor. It means to be there for one another. It means to stand up for those who have had their rights trampled upon, right? It means to be kind and generous and support one another. That's why we have universal health care. That's why we have universal public education. That's why we have universal supports right now for pharmaceutical care and others like we're building. Canada was always a nation of people there to support one another in moments of need. We have to ensure that our sector reinforces that character, that identity, that feature of our Canadianness. At a moment where fear is at the tip of everyone's tongue, where uncertainty is at the forefront of our minds, our sector has to play a role where we are telling Canadians we remain the safety net. We can't solve all problems, but we're certainly going to ensure that Canadians remember that we're there for one another. And I think that that requirement is going to become even more real over the near term future and the long term. And so, can we solve homelessness? Probably not. Can we make it easier? Sure. Can we solve food insecurity? Probably not. Can we make sure that less people are going hungry? Yes. But the one thing that we absolutely can do is we can reinforce our identity that we were there for one another in moments of need. And the sector has to ensure that it doesn't pick and choose who it's there for. It has to be there for all Canadians.
Well, on that note, I would like to give one last opportunity to look ahead, and given that we've almost gone futuristic in terms of where we're going in the sector, and I think it's such an incredibly important discussion, especially about what it means to be Canadian. I think the last months have shown that it's not just semantics. Our very fiber of who we are and our identity and our values have very much come to the foreground to show that we are distinct from uh, our neighbors south of the border. And so I think you're quite correct. Doubling down on that is something that this could be a great opportunity for the not-for-profit sector, this moment that we have. And I'm curious, what would you like to see the sector look like in the months and years ahead? What do you think it will take for the sector to get to that place?
A couple of things. I'd like our sector to not focus on preservation of assets, but the offering of support to where the community's needs are. We can't be worried that if we're not around, no one else will be there. My dad says once, um, he said to me, "You should never ignore a problem thinking that someone else is going to solve it." Right, and that's our sector. Our sector is always ignoring problems, thinking that it's someone else's solution. Well, I think I disagree because I don't think the assets that our foundations hold belong to them. I think they're actually public assets. Anytime that you've donated money and you've gotten a tax receipt, those should be considered public assets. And we now then need to have a greater sense of accountability on that, on those public assets that you now have the privilege of stewarding. And for that reason, I don't think anyone has the right to ignore particular populations and think that someone else's problem to solve. If you take a tax dollar and you get to reduce your tax burden for the donation, and then you invest that money and tomorrow it grows and you don't pay any capital gains tax, that's because every Canadian has provided that benefit to you. Therefore, every Canadian is entitled to your support. You can pick the issue you care about for sure, but the communities that are affected by that issue should also benefit from that solution. Number two, I think we need to probably recognize that the demands of government will increase. The disbursement quota today is 5%, but it could have been 10. It could have been 10. And as we see more and more pressure on government coffers and purses, believe me, we will also see greater requirements for more giving. So how about we don't wait for others to dictate to us how much we give? What if we did it on our own? Then the final component of this is I think I think we need to stop thinking about risk at our boards and senior leadership and think about impact. Mary, I get invited to sit on boards all the time. And the question I ask is, what are you looking for in a board leader? And, they say to me, somebody that can provide strategic insights and advice, provide risk assessment. And I go, and I listen and I go, what about impact? What about impact? Do you want a board that helps create the environment for you so that you could pursue impact unapologetically and with purpose and vigor? Or do you just want someone who's always helping create guardrails so that we don't get into trouble? All I know is you sometimes get into trouble when you try to do the right thing, but you almost never do the right thing if you're only trying to avoid getting into trouble. And if risk is the only thing you care about, right? And that's your primary driver, we're never going to get anything right, right? And so I think that's what I would leave as a future. Uh, we need to have more people thinking about our boards and our leadership from a position of let's try to do unapologetically. Let's make some mistakes by trying to drive impact, not trying to make sure that we get in trouble. Do you know how many organizations get audited per year?
It's a tiny, tiny amount.
Do
A
you know how
tiny
many have
amount.
gotten their Do you know how many have gotten their charitable statuses revoked?
Like, again, I just
If
finished.
you're willing,
I just finished speaking
Mary,
to.
what are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. It's like there. It's I can understand the fear of losing your charitable status as being an enormous concern, but at the same time, you're quite right. Like, just how big a risk is it, and particularly when you can remedy things if there's been an inadvertent error.
Those are my thoughts. Be more courageous. Don't worry about risk. Think about making sure you bring in the folks who want to do the greatest, boldest good. Make sure that you remember that you are stewarding public assets and that there's no charitable sector today without the public contributions of every single Canadian who pay taxes. And remember your accountability to them.
Well, Liban, thank you very much for your insights and sharing your experience and advice with our audience. It's actually an inspiring moment to be able to speak to you about this, particularly with all the challenges that we're facing right now. And we need more bold action in the sector. I couldn't agree with you more. And I really appreciate hearing your views about how to achieve a more equitable level of influence within the sector for every or more. For more organizations so that it better reflects the diverse communities it serves. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
I leave you with one last comment. A friend of mine said, it's not enough to declare that we're Canadian. It's important to remember the why we're Canadian. The nonprofit sector is one of the greatest definitions of what it means to be a Canadian, and the work that we do is our why. Let's not forget that.
Well said. Thank you very much.